Hey, I'm Pastor Steve. Welcome to the Midweek Encouragement Word. I've been reading in 1 Corinthians lately. I'm towards the end of the letter. And toward the end, Paul is saying how he's going to be coming again at one point to take up this collection, this offering, in order to give it to those in need in Jerusalem. He'll come and take the money as well as their letters and pass those things along. And he would love to be able to spend some extra time with them, but he's not going to be able to do that because he wants to be in this other place where he's having this great opportunity of ministry. And he said he even asked Apollos if he wanted to come because Apollos was very influential in starting this church as well, but Apollos didn't want to come at this point, and so he was going to be sending Timothy along. And now I think it's very interesting what Paul said to this church about Timothy and how to respond to Timothy. In chapter 16, verse 10, he said, "If Timothy comes, see that he has nothing to fear while with you, because he's doing the Lord's work just as I am. So let no one look down on him." I don't think there's anybody else that Paul writes to a church and says, hey, I'm going to send this person, and make sure you don't look down upon them. Make sure you don't see them as not as valuable as if I were to come. And now there certainly was this weird division, this rivalry that we hear in the beginning of the letter in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, that some were saying, well, I became a Christ follower of the ministry of Apollos. Well, I became a Christ follower with the ministry of Paul. And so there became this kind of weird argument going on. And Paul saying, well, I'm not going to be able to be there. Apollos isn't going to be there. And I'm sending Timothy. And don't think that Timothy is just kind of like a nobody. Timothy is an important person in the ministry of the gospel. Well, who was Timothy? We know a little bit about Timothy, that tradition says that he was a young guy who became a Christ follower, and Paul picked him up and became a co-worker with him in his missionary trips there. But there's also a tradition that says that Timothy probably maybe not as young as they would think, that he wasn't in his 20s or early 30s during his ministry with Paul. He was perhaps in his 30s or 40s in his ministry with Paul. Now, he was certainly 20 years younger than Paul. But Paul even writes at the end of his life to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 12, he says, "Don't let anyone despise your youth." Well, if Timothy was in his late 30s or 40s, he certainly wasn't a young guy. But I think that when you make a comparison between Paul and Timothy, Timothy was a young guy, or at least inexperienced in comparison to Paul. And I can relate to that in that my wife and I have been married for 22 years, and someone who's been married 5, 6, 7 years would see, wow, that's a long time. But there's plenty of people who have been married for 30, 35, 40 years, and they look at us and say, wow, you guys are so young. And I think that's the case, where Timothy was with Paul, and he was a part of his ministry for sure, but Paul had the highlight, the limelight of preaching and teaching, and he was the one who just knew what to say, was very witty, who had the right answers, and was more experienced, where Timothy was just seen maybe as his assistant, the guy who carried the letters from church to church and would kind of pass along some teachings that Paul had encouraged them to learn. But really, Timothy had all of the gifts and tools to do ministry himself. He just hadn't necessarily given the opportunity and platform to do so as he was with the great apostle Paul. And so there's an encouragement for the church to not look down on Timothy as the guy who just is inexperienced and not as well spoken as Paul. And also encouragement for Timothy to not look at himself as someone who's inadequate, who's not as gifted as somebody else, such as himself. In fact, in 1 Timothy chapter 4, he says, don't neglect the gift that is in you. There's something in you that's special, that can do this. And so don't neglect that. Reinforce that. In verse 15, he says, practice these things, be committed to them, so that your progress may be evident to all. He says, practice these things. You may have not had the opportunity to do them, but to work at them, to practice them, to be committed to these things. And you're going to progress. You're going to get better. It's going to become easier for you. And everyone's going to be able to notice that. And so I think that is an encouragement for young people, including myself, who may not see myself as being as eloquent or as experienced as someone who's 20 years farther along in the ministry. And for someone who's younger than me, they may feel inadequate. And how can they possibly say those things so well? But to practice those things, to be committed, to be involved. If you're younger, to come alongside someone who is older, more experienced, and to learn from them. And someone who is older, to carry along someone who is younger so that they can just learn from you, but also that you can learn from them. I think it's important for the church to really see young people as valuable in the ministry. Not just someone who can do things because they're young and they're more energetic and they're stronger and they can kind of do the grunt work, but really someone who is valuable, who has a lot to share and to encourage us and to rebuke us and to correct us even at times, to be solid in the faith. And so give them those opportunities to do so and encourage them to be committed to the faith. If you are young, I encourage you to be committed to the ministry, to take advantage of every opportunity that you have to be a part of the church. And whether that's teaching young children or whether that's being involved in the youth, just to be involved. And so when those opportunities come, because our lives at one point have to end, just as Paul's life had to end, he encouraged Timothy, you already know everything that you need to know. And now is your time to fill in the gap that Paul had once done. And so I hope that is encouragement for you. I hope that's something that you would seek out and study on your own. Well, God bless. We'll see you next time.